There we go.
Oh, good afternoon, everybody. Um, Seems a little loud, huh? Okay. Um, this is a subject that will be very different from what happened in here this morning when people were dancing in the aisles to Broadway, history of Broadway. And there'll be more music at 3:30 when John begins first rehearsal of the Oklahoma Choir. So in the middle is a little bit of a downer, and that's the Great Depression. Um, so I'm going to start. Today we'll be taking a look at America's Great Depression, that catastrophic event which, in the end, opened the door for the New Deal. So, what caused the Great Depression? That question has been debated by scholars, economists, doctoral dissertations, but I'm finding about the only thing they really agree on is that it was a multitude of events and situations that all came together at a very bad time. I've tried to pull together many of the strands of that story, but I certainly am not going to get them all. But with that, let's get started. Okay. Well, the first ominous stirrings of the Great Depression can be traced back to the end of the First World War. In the peace talks at the end of that devastating war, the victorious Allies imposed very harsh economic penalties on Germany. And this is supposed to advance, but it doesn't seem to be. There we go. And in this little cartoon, you'll see that what the Allies were really demanding was that Germany pay for all the damage to civilians throughout the war. Now, these penalties went far beyond what the shattered German economy could pay. Economists and diplomats alike warned that such vindictive terms would lead to instability and slow recovery in Europe. But after all the suffering caused by the war, the victorious Allies were in no mood to listen to that. As Admiral Geddes explained his view, the Germans are going to pay every penny. They are going to be squeezed as a lemon is squeezed until the pips squeak. So, with the post-war German economy crippled by reparations under a huge debt, and the rest of the European economies greatly weakened by the war, economic recovery in Europe was painfully slow. And as a result, international trade, which the US had been able to take advantage of before and during the war, declined significantly after the war. American exports fell at a time when the US economy was still booming as a result of wartime demand. Now, the American industrial economy took only a few years to transition away from its wartime footing, but then rebounded and grew substantially in what became the Roaring Twenties. For rural America, the 1920s were a very different story. They would be the start of 20 years of hard times in the farming communities. And keep in mind here that at that time, almost half of America was defined as rural. This included farmers and residents in small communities all over the country whose economies depended in one way or another on farming. During the war, agriculture production in Europe fell dramatically, which created strong demand for U.S. farm exports to feed the world. The U.S. government urged farmers to increase production, even adding price support measures to shore up prices, which were already rising sharply around the world. The high wartime world demand and high prices couldn't have come at a more opportune moment for U.S. farmers. Farming was undergoing dramatic change at that time due to mechanization. There's what we want to see. The first tractors are arriving in the fields of American farms. Tractors and other motorized equipment were revolutionizing farm productivity. And with prices and demand going through the roof, farmers used mechanization to put millions more acres of land under the plow. Some of those extra acres came directly as a result of mechanization. All farms at that time had 5 to 10% of their land devoted to support of their farm animals, the horses and the mules. When the tractors arrived, those were the first acres to go back into production and under the plow. The war years were heady times for American farmers. Land prices rose sharply, reflecting the profitability of farming. Farmers incurred rising debt as they financed land and equipment purchases with local banks, most of which were small and not highly capitalized. Carrying that debt didn't seem to be a problem for either the farmers or the banks, with high production levels and high prices producing record profits. That party came to an abrupt end when the war was over. World commodity markets collapsed after the war as debt-laden European countries, which were slow to recover, could no longer sustain their previous high levels of agricultural imports from U.S. farmers. That meant that high U.S. agriculture production was suddenly out of balance with world demand, and prices for farm products plunged. The U.S. government revoked farm price supports in 1920, which only accelerated the price drops. Let's see, we're going to have to get back in sequence here. Right. From 1919 to 1920, just 1 year, the price of corn dropped from $1.30 to just 47 cents a bushel. I've dropped it 67%. The prices for other farm products went the same way. As prices for farm commodities fell, farmers responded. Here we go now, let's see. Farmers responded by keeping production high, hoping that the high volume would make up for the profits lost due to lower prices. But that was a losing strategy, of course. Continued overproduction just accelerated the falling prices. Gotta keep my mouth dry. As farmers sustained losses, they were unable to meet debt obligations, and the banks were forced to foreclose on equipment loans and farm mortgages. In the foreclosures, the banks took possession of farms and equipment which were worth much less than what they loaned the money to purchase them. As a result, the banks could only sell these assets, which they had repossessed, at losses. And as a result, a lot of the smaller rural banks began to fail. When these banks failed, the savings of local depositors disappeared, which hit rural farmers and families and their economies very hard. The banks that remained became much more selective in making farm loans, which meant the primary source of credit for farm operations also dried up, adding further to the difficult situation farmers found themselves in. The desperate farm situation continued through the 20s and got even worse in the 30s. The New Deal enacted some programs designed to help, but the fundamental disconnect between agricultural supply and demand kept farm commodity prices at historic lows through most of the 1930s until World War II finally brought things back into balance. Let's see. Let's skip this. There's an example of what was a common scene back in the 20s. In fact, I remember some of these. I grew up near a farm. I was in a farming community, but my dad used to take me to the sales, as you'll see there on the right, where there'd be farmers selling their equipment. Their land was often for sale at the same time. It was a tough time. For the U.S. industrial economy, things were very different in the 20s. The industrial economy took about 2 years after the end of the First World War to transition away from its wartime footing to meet new consumer demands at home. And this is a good example, I think, was of the way half of the country, the rural half, looked at what happened in the 20s in the cities. The cities were booming, and the farmers were having a tough time. In the 1920s, the country started implementing mass electrification, and especially in the cities and the suburbs. This created demand for a whole new range of appliances and products: refrigerators, stoves, radios, plenty of new businesses for American industries to invest in. Demand was also high for cars, mass-produced cars, which in turn stimulated the construction of roads and transportation infrastructure in the country. Residential and commercial construction was also booming in the cities and suburbs. Skyscrapers were going up in all major American cities. These were the roaring 20s. The U.S. industrial economy grew by 40% in the 20s. Jobs were plentiful, and people had money to spend. One very important factor contributing to industrial prosperity in the 20s was the favorable climate for big business. By 1918, President Wilson's administration, very progressive, as you recall, had begun to run out of steam. In the midterm elections of 1918, Wilson was expecting a strong Democratic showing to serve as an endorsement for his progressive domestic and international policies. Instead, the Republicans surged to take control of the House of Representatives, a sign of the changing mood in the country. Then in October of 1919, Wilson suffered a catastrophic and debilitating stroke, and the White House was basically at a standstill for the rest of his term. And by the way, tomorrow afternoon at 1:30, Barbara Oberlander will be speaking in this room, and her subject, just by coincidence, is the life of Edith Wilson, who was President Wilson's wife, and who basically ran the White House for almost 2 years, the last 2 years of his term. And that'll be a fascinating story. Don't miss that. Okay. That's at 1:30 tomorrow afternoon. As expected, in 1920, Republican Warren G. Harding won the presidency in a landslide, ushering in a decade-long pro-business Republican control in Washington. Harding proclaimed that business practices would be a model for the American government. Calling for less government in business and more business in government. He was in tune with the times and was one of America's most popular sitting presidents. Unfortunately, Harding died unexpectedly of a heart attack while he was touring San Francisco in 1923. His popularity, though, was tarnished later when they discovered scandals and corruptions in his short time in office. Vice President Calvin Coolidge succeeded Harding, and then he easily won the presidency in his own right in 1924. Coolidge continued to set the administration's pro-business tone, declaring that civilization and profit go hand in hand. And this is a business country, and it wants a business government. Coolidge chose not to run for a second full term at the end of 1927. So in 1928, the Republicans nominated Herbert Hoover, who ran on the campaign slogan, which I think everybody remembers, a chicken in every pot and a car in every garage. Good times. He trounced Democrat Al Smith in that election, and the Republican small government pro-business policies in Washington rolled on. But beneath the industrial prosperity of the 20s, weaknesses and flaws were developing in the nation's economy. There were serious flaws in the nation's banking system. Excuse me. The banking system was still made up mostly of thousands of small, often undercapitalized banks. The plight of the small rural banks in the 20s did not lead to any reform in the overall banking sector. City banks were still lending freely to consumers and businesses, often without due diligence for credit risk. The U.S. did have a central bank at that time, the Federal Reserve, but bank regulation and oversight was not part of its mission. Its primary role was to defend the value of the U.S. dollar against other world currencies. In fact, in 1931, as the Depression was raging on, the Fed raised U.S. interest rates to defend the dollar, but in doing so, of course, further restricted the availability of credit and slowed the chances for recovery. There was no central mechanism at the Fed for monitoring or regulating the stability of the banking system. Such an expanded rule would have been absolutely inconsistent with the Republican policy of minimum government involvement in business. Another danger was that the prosperity of the 20s was not evenly shared. Most of the gains were going to large corporations and executives, while consumer wages and wealth stagnated in the 20s. By the late 20s, the growing lack of consumer purchasing power caused overall consumer demand to slow down. And as the demand slowed down, corporate sales and profits also dropped. As a result, the corporations began responding by cutting back on production and by slowing down investment and expansion in the economy. All this was leading to workforce layoffs and a further erosion of consumer confidence in general. Now, just as economic growth in the US was slowing, it was also slowing around the world. And many nations were turning to protective tariffs to protect their industries from competition, from foreign competition. That's, of course, a red flag when it comes to stimulating economic growth. So in 1930, the Republican-led Congress passed the Smoot-Hawley tariff bill. Economists and business leaders vigorously lobbied President Hoover to veto the tariff, citing the negative impact it would have on growth and on international trade. Henry Ford spent an evening at the White House trying to convince Hoover to veto the tariff bill, calling it economic stupidity. J.P. Morgan's chief executive said he almost went down on his knees to beg Hoover to veto that asinine bill. But in the end, Hoover sided with the Republican Congress and signed Smoot-Hawley into law, raising U.S. tariffs on dutiable items to a massive 59%. Predictably, this triggered higher retaliatory tariffs by most of America's trading partners, accelerating the decline of U.S. exports and causing further industry cutbacks. U.S. exports fell from $5.4 billion in 1929 to $2.1 billion in 1933. And finally, there was the U.S. stock market. Although only about 3% of Americans own stock shares directly, many more Americans perceive the stock market as an important measure of the nation's economic health. The Dow Jones average gained some 400% between 1920 and 1929, which certainly looked like an excellent health report for the nation's economy. Throughout 1928, stock prices rocketed upwards, and they kept going in the first months of 1929 in what was called the Great Hoover Bull Market. But rampant speculation and margin trading finally pushed the market over the edge, leading to the great crash, which culminated on October 29th, 1929, Black Tuesday. These were the scenes that were all so common that day. Traders perplexed, people in the streets trying to understand what happened. Precipitous market losses were sustained through the rest of October and were followed by a steady decline in prices for the next 3 years until the market finally hit bottom in July of 1932, down 89% from its high in 1929. Black Tuesday is commonly viewed as the official start of the Great Depression. Looking back over the many other contributing factors, most economists now agree that the stock market crash did not cause the depression, but it was definitely the catalyst for the stunningly rapid collapse which followed. Confidence in virtually all areas of the economy began to evaporate with the crash. The structures of American capitalism seemed to collapse as the beliefs and institutions central to its operation no longer seemed to work. Ultimately, in any capitalist system, belief on the part of the stakeholders, consumers, workers, and employers, is crucial to its functioning. And following the market crash on Black Tuesday, that belief was shaken to the core. The banking system led the way in the collapse following Black Tuesday. As we've said before, the nation's banking system was composed mostly of small independent banks. But the financial losses associated with the market crash put particularly great pressure on the nation's larger money center banks, resulting in spectacular and highly publicized bank runs and failures, especially in New York. This in turn led to a growing distrust in the safety and stability of banks in general, giving rise to a growing wave of bank runs and failures all over the country. A proactive Federal Reserve might have stepped in at that point, but it hadn't the tools or the will to do so. Once the bank failures began, there was no mechanism for slowing them down. Between 1929 and 1933, about half of the nation's 25,000 banks either failed outright or were forced to merge with a competitor, wiping out the savings of countless Americans. As the banking system folded, consumer demand also crashed when families were hit hard by the bleak realities of the Depression. The demand for goods in the economy fell drastically, producing stunning corporate losses. Business confidence, let's go back here. Business in the, here we are. Business confidence in the economy almost completely evaporated. The nation's gross national product dropped by 31% between 1929 and 1933. Business executives were nearly united in their belief that the economy was not only doing badly, but it was doing so bad that it was best not to invest the firm's capital at all. And remember, this is the period when nearly all key decisions regarding investment in the economy came from the business community. Just between the years 1929 and 1933, national economic investment dropped by 87%. You can see that. I'm sorry. Um, Corporate profits also dropped by 90% from $10 billion in 29 to just $1 billion in 1933, while unemployment climbed to record heights. Over 100,000 businesses were forced to close, and there's your corporate profits, and 30% of the U.S. non-farm labor force was unemployed. And about the same number could only find part-time work. These were the common scenes around the country. Oh my goodness, what's going on here? Here we go. It's estimated that 2 million Americans became transients, people who simply drifted from place to place, wandering across the nation in search of opportunity. I remember in my small town, we lived right next to the railroad tracks. And back even into the time of the war, it was still not unusual to see um, people riding on the tops of the boxcars as they just went from place to place looking for something to eat and something to do. The situation in the farm economy was just as bad. After struggling through the 20s, farmers saw commodity prices plunge even further as the bad times spread to the whole economy. Net farm income plummeted an additional 60% between 1929 and 1932, and about 1/3 of the nation's farmers who managed to survive through the 20s lost their farms in the 30s. And almost perversely, Mother Nature piled her own hardship on the farmers in the form of the Great Dust Bowl, making the 1930s a terrible time to be a farmer in America. The downward depression spiral began in just the first year of the Hoover administration. Now, Hoover was a Stanford graduate in mining engineering. Early in his life, he embarked on an engineering career abroad and ultimately became a self-made millionaire. He entered public life in 1914 and because of his efficiency and dedication, achieved a remarkable record as somebody who could get things done. In the 20s, Hoover served as Commerce Secretary through both the Harding and Coolidge administrations. And commentators at that time said that in those presidential cabinets, there was Hoover, and then there was everybody else. In 1927, Hoover gained even more acclaim for his response to the national disaster caused by the Great Flood of the Mississippi River. Some historians said that he was the most qualified person to occupy the White House up to that time. It would seem that the country would be in very good hands to deal with the rapidly developing severe depression. But Hoover held firmly to the Republican belief in policies which featured a limited federal government role in the economy. In his inaugural address in March of 1929, when the economy was still seemingly riding high, he outlined a continued belief in limited government and a deep respect for Americans to help themselves, saying, "Progress is born of cooperation, not from government restraints or programs. Government should assist and encourage movements of collective self-help by the people." Throughout those first terrible years of the collapse, Hoover held to the belief that patience, knowledge, and optimism by the people were the solutions to the economic crisis. He called leading businessmen into the White House and urged them to invest in the economy. Of course, voluntarily. Not too many of them wanted to do it. And peppered his speeches and public pronouncements with optimistic predictions of an early return to prosperity. In his State of the Union address in December of 1930, months after Black Tuesday, and with the economy clearly spiraling downward, Hoover reaffirmed his position on government, saying economic depression cannot be cured by federal legislative action or executive pronouncement. Economic wounds must be healed by the actions of the cells of the economic body, the producers and consumers themselves. No mention there of a stronger role for government to help stem the tide. Hoover was sincere in his beliefs, but his failure was ultimately one of outmoded ideology, one that no longer worked in a large, highly complex, and interconnected economy. Public policies that rested on moral suasion, limited federal involvement, and generosity of private charities were just too limited and too effective to make headway against the Great Depression. With little help coming from the government, and with business leaders paralyzed by the extent of the economic carnage, the Depression continued to steadily worsen during the final years of Hoover's presidency. He became increasingly withdrawn and depressed, and was deeply hurt when shanty towns, which sprung up all over the country, were called Hoovervilles. His administration did finally try several federal rescue programs, but they were too little, too late. Hoover and his administration simply had no vision for what a federal response to the Depression would look like. In the 1932 presidential election campaign, Franklin Roosevelt and the Democrats offered Americans a vision of what federal government could do when fully engaged in fighting the Depression. And the voters responded, giving him a landslide victory over Hoover and sweeping the Democrats into control of Congress. By Inauguration Day, in March of 1933, the Depression had been running virtually unchecked for more than 3 years, and the nation was mired in the very depths of the Great Depression. In that inauguration, the nation looked with anxiety and hope to Roosevelt and the Democrats for a New Deal for America. And we'll stop there, and next week we'll take a look at the New Deal itself. Thank you. I'm sure almost everybody has something that they remember or experience regarding the Depression. I'd answer any questions now, or if you just want to make comments, the floor is yours. Any of you have parents or grandparents that lost a business or a farm?
I was born in 1933, and I've always wondered how my parents had the courage to get pregnant at that particular time. But it clearly affected their lives forever because we never bought anything that we didn't pay cash for. My parents lost the home they had built right after I was born, moved into a small house. And again, for the rest of their lives, they were not borrowers. If they couldn't pay for it in cash, including cars, they didn't buy it. Yeah. And I've inherited some of that.
Maybe that's not all bad. Doug.
So adding to what Roy said, this is not personal experience. What my grandfather, my mother's father, with whom I spent much of my childhood on Saturdays, and my mother told me. So he built the house that my grandparents lived in and raised their 3 children just after World War I. He was a shoe factory worker for his entire life. during the Depression, he didn't lose his job, but was on short hours.
Yeah.
So what did he do? First of all, he learned how to service Model A, Model T Fords, and he became an authorized Ford dealer out of his garage in the backyard.
Huh.
And he would repair people's cars, and he would accept apparently chickens and things like that, in payment. He built a chicken house, and that part I do remember. I used to help him get eggs and shovel the manure and all that kind of stuff. So they adapted that way. And it was like Roy said, they never borrowed. If they couldn't afford it, they didn't buy it. My mother says we never went hungry. We got 3 meals a day. They all went through high school, and one of them went on to college. So some people adapted. And by the way, they never voted for a Democrat in their entire life.
Well, I think you'll see in the lectures coming the next 2 weeks when Richard McMaster will cover the New Deal itself. The New Deal was not without opposition. The Republicans, even though they had obviously fumbled the ball badly during the Depression, fought Roosevelt every step of the way. Any other questions?
Well, Paul Parker, did you have a comment? You're muted. Paul, you're still muted. All right, we're going to come back to you, Paul, if you get it
Yeah.
unmuted.
Okay, I'm unmuted now.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, just to add a little anecdote which reveals some of the data that you've just shown. My dad was the first one in his family, fairly large family, to go to college. He went to Cornell in agriculture because his family were farmers in upstate New York. And he had not long before the crash, he had been working in New York. And this was quite an event in his family, that he was now working, in downtown New York, and with a company that sold high value fertilizers, and he was working in experiment stations. And so when the crash hit, his family up in Spencerport, New York, were being threatened to have to sell the farm. And so my family on Long Island in suburban New York said that the family should come down to Rockville Center, Long Island. Well, that was about 8 or 9 people. And so they all were scrambling. I can recall, I was born September 1st, 1932. So I was born, I tell people, in the Hoover administration. But when the crash hit and the dislocations happened and the family came, then everybody I can remember was finding all kinds of part-time work. And my father got hooked up with a company that sold rototillers, because people in the suburbs were trying to grow their own food and were tearing up their yards and planting things. So I can remember we all were just sort of like most people, not to be extravagant, quote unquote. And extravagant meant sometimes it was going down to the store and getting a candy bar. So I think all those who experienced the 30s and experienced that have very sharp, trenchant memories of what it really was like as a human being, to have all of a sudden everything just changing in your life, you and everybody who was close to you.
Yeah. And I think that that suddenness really hit people hard.
Yes, it did.
Things seemed to be going on fairly well, and then bam, the crash, and all of a sudden nobody believed in anything anymore. And in a matter of 2 or 3 years, that's where we were, 33% unemployment.
Yeah, yeah.
That question here. Yeah.
When one set of my grandparents lived near the edge of their town, and it was said that my grandmother would never deny a migrant a bowl of soup and a piece of bread.
Of course, there was also, I remember in my town, there was a little bit of a fear, um, of the strangers, coming, because they would come to your door. And I know, my grandmother was particularly, frightened. It's just one of those situations.
Okay, let's go to Rick on Zoom.
Thanks very much. I worked in the administration of food assistance programs from the US government overseas, which were initiated in 1954 to deal with an agricultural surplus situation. And the predecessor of that program was a program that was run by Herbert Hoover in the late teens and early 20s that allowed the distribution of US food in Europe, including the Soviet Union after the revolution, and sort of linked trying to reduce the amount of consumption of food in the US to allow food to be distributed in Europe. He also went into, became the head of the US Food Administration in the 20s, where he was able to think through how to deal with the problems of American agriculture, which eventually led into the 30s of next week that you'll be discussing the Agricultural Adjustment Act, where they killed millions of hogs and destroyed enormous amounts of crops and cotton. But just fascinating in terms of where we're coming and how to deal with surpluses of agriculture and devastated rural economies.
On my mom's side of the family, my grandfather had managed to maintain a fairly large farm, and cash was king. And he had started the Depression with a fairly sizable amount of money, and so they bought up land, and that set something different on that side. But my father came from a very poor family, but they all believed in education. And he tried to start college, was unable to stay in college, so he joined the Navy. So from 32 to 36, he served on the battleship Arizona, came back having saved a lot of money, got his college education. And so that set our family on a slightly different trajectory.
Yeah.
Thank you, Donna. Go ahead on Zoom.
Hello. I just put in chat the fact that for me, the most telling political fact about the Depression is that by the time Franklin Roosevelt took office, every single state government was bankrupt from trying to deal with the consequence of the Depression.
They were ready, weren't they, for a change?
Yes.
So,
I was born during the Second World War. My late husband, Arthur, however, was born in 1927, and he had significant memories, even as an adolescent, as a young child, of the disruption of the Depression. His grandparents were farmers in western Alachua County. But his father, as the oldest of four, came to the University of Florida and made a career as a banker. He was a bank teller When the Depression happened, they moved to Atlanta and he worked for the Federal Reserve and traveled around the Southeast closing banks and ultimately became a bank president.
Yeah.
On my family's side, my mother's parents, her father died as an electric lineman in Philadelphia, and there was no insurance, no compensation to her mother. So my maternal grandmother was alone with two small children and what to do. She became a housekeeper, and she and her children lived with other people's families, and she did the cooking and the cleaning and all the housework. So there was a lot of social disruption during that time.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it boggles my mind that I had 2 semesters of American history and we never talked about the lead up to the Depression. Never. And it's what I heard from you sounds like Reaganism. That's what the Republicans were pushing at that time. And that is echoed now by the Republicans. Do people not ever learn?
Well, I thought a lot about that, and that pro-business Republican strain that ran all through the 20s was I'd say very reflective of American culture, of independence, of self-reliance. It wasn't bad. It just suddenly ran out of bandwidth, if you will. And some people took a lot longer to realize that than others, obviously. But it does kind of boggle the mind that as things were collapsing, there was a lot of spectating going on, but not a lot of intervention to try to slow things down.
Larry Lowenthal, would you like to share your comment in chat? No. So Ron, it says in 1934, American business and political elites of the United States worked together to establish the American Liberty League, an organization with the purpose of opposing the New Deal.
Yeah, it wasn't easy. And of course the courts, you'll hear all this from Richard in the next 2 weeks, but the courts were also not Roosevelt's friend during that period. Well, thank you so much for listening and being part of this. Come back next week and we'll see how Roosevelt and his brain trust went to work after they were inaugurated in March of 1933. Yeah. Right. And don't forget, Barbara will be here tomorrow at 1:30. Thanks. It really was surprising how
Talk be zoomed.